Juniper Rutledge was 21 years old, and the state of Ohio had officially run out of reasons to keep her. That was how the system worked, if you could call it a system at all. You could be broken in 100 quiet ways nobody had bothered to name. You could have no family, no address that belonged to you, no plan for next Tuesday, let alone the rest of your life. But the moment the calendar turned on your 21st birthday, none of that mattered anymore. The paperwork closed itself the way a door closes when the wind decides it's time. The bed you'd slept in was needed for someone younger. You walked out carrying whatever fit in your two arms, and the door did not open again behind you. She sat on the edge of a narrow bed that had never once in 3 years felt like it belonged to her. Two duffel bags and a backpack stood lined up against the wall like soldiers waiting for an order nobody had given yet. 14 years of a life reduced to that. A few shirts gone soft in other girls' washing machines long before they ever reached her hands. A stack of paperback novels bought for a quarter apiece at library sales, their spines cracked white from being read by strangers before her and read again by her afterward. In one photograph, its corners worn round and pale from being carried and put away, and carried again, her parents young and laughing, standing in front of a white farmhouse she had never once been able to place. She did not know yet that in 6 months she would be standing on the porch of that very kind of house, facing down a man in an expensive coat, her voice steadier than her hands. She did not know that a barn was waiting for her 2 states away, a barn so strange and so enormous that grown men would slow their trucks on the road just to look at it. She did not know about the 247 letters. She did not know that morning that she was not as alone in this world as 14 years of silence had taught her to believe. But to understand any of that, you have to go back to the last morning. She woke up inside St. Agnes' home for children in a room that smelled the way it always smelled, like industrial detergent and radiator heat, in the particular staleness of a building that had housed thousands of childhoods and kept none of them. Have you ever woken up in a room and known the very second your eyes opened that this was the last time you would ever wake up in it? The window by her bed looked out over a parking lot instead of a yard. The asphalt cracked in long veins where weeds had learned over the years to push their way up through anything given long enough. Juniper had spent more mornings than she could count watching those weeds instead of getting out of bed telling herself there was something almost admirable about a thing that kept forcing its way up through concrete that had been poured specifically to stop it. She was 21. She had $41 folded into a rubber band at the bottom of her backpack, and she had never in her life held more money than that at one time. She had a birth certificate, a social security card, and a thin manila folder that contained, as far as the state of Ohio was concerned, the entire sum of who she was. Loretta Finch knocked on her door at exactly 8 o'clock. Juniper knew it was exactly 8 because Ms. Finch had never once in 3 years of visits arrived a minute early or a minute late. There was something almost comforting in that precision, the way a heartbeat is comforting simply because it keeps happening whether or not you notice it. "You ready, Juniper?" She was not ready. She understood even as she said the word yes that there was no version of this morning she could have prepared herself for, because readiness required something to prepare against, and nobody had ever explained to her what waited on the other side of a closed file. She followed Ms. Finch down the same hallway she had walked more times than she could count, and for the first time she let herself really look at it, the way you look hard at something you know you'll never see again. The door to the room where 2 9-year-old girls were fighting in low, furious whispers over a hairbrush neither of them owned. The cafeteria that smelled permanently of reheated oatmeal and industrial bleach, where she had eaten thousands of forgettable meals at the same long table at the same hour for 14 years running. The common room with its television bolted to the wall, where she had spent countless evenings staring at a screen without really watching anything on it, letting the noise fill a silence that would otherwise have had too much room to fill her instead. In the small office at the end of the hall, Ms. Finch opened a folder with Juniper's name typed across the tab in a font that had gone slightly faded from being run through the copier too many times. 14 years of a girl's entire existence and it fit inside a folder that thin. "You've got your identification documents," Ms. Finch said, not quite looking up. "Birth certificate, social security card, information on transitional housing, though I'll tell you now the waiting list is running about 3 months." She turned a page. "Job placement resources. Numbers 4. "Yes, ma'am," Juniper said, because that answer got you out the door fastest. And getting out the door fast had become somewhere over the years its own kind of survival skill. Ms. Finch closed the folder. Then she paused, the particular pause of someone remembering almost too late a thing they'd nearly let slip past them, and reached toward a second envelope, sitting slightly apart from the rest of the paperwork on her desk. "This came for you last week from a law office." She turned it over in her hands once before passing it across the desk. Vermont. Juniper had never known anyone in Vermont. She had never in her life held paper this heavy, this expensive, the kind of cream-colored stationery that seemed to come from an entirely different version of the world than the one she'd grown up inside. The return address read, "Merrow and Associates Attorneys at Law Burlington, Vermont," printed in a font with actual weight to it, the kind of letters that looked like somebody had paid extra simply for the way they sat on the page. She opened it the way you open something that might, for all you know, be a trick designed specifically to disappoint you. Inside was a single typed letter from an attorney named Franklin Merrow, informing her that her maternal grandmother, a woman named Ida Rutledge, had passed away 3 months earlier at the age of 79. She read the sentence twice before the words agreed to mean anything at all. Her grandmother. She barely remembered her. There had been a few blurred visits very early before the accident had taken everything and rearranged the rest of her childhood into a sequence of foster placements and group homes, and a decade and a half of belonging in any real sense to absolutely no one. She remembered a pair of hands that had smelled faintly of sawdust and lemon oil, a voice that had called her something soft she could no longer quite recall the shape of. And then nothing. A silence so long and so complete that it had somewhere along the way calcified into simple fact: my grandmother didn't want me, didn't want him. The system had reached out once at the very beginning when there had still been a chance to do something different with the story. Ida Rutledge had said no. Too old, they'd told Juniper years later, once she was old enough to ask the question and brave enough to survive the answer. Too remote. Unable to properly care for a child. She had spent years afterward wondering what exactly was wrong with her, the particular kind of wrong that made even your own blood turn away from you when you needed them most. Eventually, she had simply stopped wondering because it hurt less to believe she had no one at all than to believe someone had looked directly at her and chosen deliberately not to come. And now, according to this letter, that same grandmother had left her a farm. 60 acres of land in a place called Millbrook Hollow, Vermont. A farmhouse, a barn, several smaller outbuildings, and a savings account holding a little over $12,000. $12,000. Juniper had 41 folded into a rubber band, and she had never once in her life possessed more than a few hundred at any given moment. 12,000 might as well have been 12 million. "Everything all right?" Ms. Finch was watching her now with an expression Juniper hadn't seen on her before: open curiosity entirely unguarded. "My grandmother died," Juniper heard herself say. "She left me a farm." The words sounded absurd coming out of her own mouth, like lines borrowed from somebody else's life entirely. Girls like her didn't inherit farms. Girls like her inherited nothing but bad luck and low expectations packed carefully into duffel bags and carried from one temporary address to the next. "A farm," Ms. Finch repeated slowly. "In Vermont. Juniper, this could change everything for you." Could it? She wasn't sure yet that she believed that. In her experience, when something looked too good to be true, there was almost always a catch buried somewhere beneath it, the way a nail eventually works its way back up through old flooring, no matter how many times you hammer it down flat. She called the number on the letterhead from a payphone outside the building, the only place left in town as far as she knew, where the phone still took coins instead of demanding a card she didn't own. Her hands were cold enough that she had to dial twice before the numbers agreed to cooperate. A man answered on the third ring, his voice warm and unhurried, the voice of someone who had spent decades delivering both kinds of news in equal measure and had learned somewhere along the way to hold them both with the same steady hand. Miss Rutledge, I've been hoping you'd call. I'm very sorry for your loss. My loss. As if you could lose something you had never really been allowed to have in the first place. Your grandmother was very specific in her instructions, Franklin Marrow told her. She wanted you to have the farm the moment you aged out of the foster system, 18 or 21, whichever came first. She also left a letter for you, which I'm required to deliver in person, along with a few other items she wanted you to have. Why didn't she? Juniper stopped herself before the question finished forming. It felt too large somehow for a payphone conversation with a stranger. But Marrow seemed to understand the shape of it anyway, even unfinished. Your grandmother had her reasons for the choices she made, Miss Rutledge. I believe her letter will explain a great deal of it when you're ready to read it. When can you come to Burlington? When could she come? She had nowhere else in the world to be. No job waiting for her, no apartment lined up, no life to return to except a waiting list 3 months long, and a bed that was already by tonight going to belong to somebody else. As soon as I can get there, she said. She spent 31 of her $41 on a Greyhound ticket that same afternoon, leaving her with exactly $10 to her name and a distance of nearly 600 miles between the life she was leaving and whatever was waiting for her at the end of it. The bus pulled out of the station a little after 4 in the afternoon, and Juniper settled into a seat near the back where she could watch the world slide past through a window scratched pale by years of careless hands. The other passengers were a mixture of tired travelers heading somewhere ordinary and people who looked in the particular way she had learned to recognize, like they were running from something rather than toward it. She fit in fine either way. She thought somewhere around the Pennsylvania line about her mother, Vesta Rutledge. She had grown up on that farm in Vermont, walked those same 60 acres, known that same grandmother in ways Juniper never would. What had made her leave, nobody had ever fully explained it. Only that a falling out had happened somewhere before the accident, something old and stubborn that had never quite healed itself in time. She pulled the photograph out of her backpack and studied it again under the dim reading light above her seat. The white farmhouse in the background. Was that the farm? Was she looking without even knowing it yet at the exact place she was about to inherit? Her mother's face offered no answers. She simply smiled into the camera, young and beautiful, and entirely unaware that she had less than a decade left to live. Juniper fell asleep somewhere around the New York border and woke as the bus crossed into Vermont, the landscape having changed completely while she slept. Rolling hills still holding the last patches of winter snow in their shadowed folds. White farmhouses with red barns standing at careful, deliberate distances from one another. Stone walls running through the fields like rivers that had frozen solid 100 years ago and simply never remembered how to thaw. It looked like a postcard. It looked more than anything like a country she had never once been told she belonged to. Franklin Marrow's office occupied a converted Victorian house in Burlington, the kind of building that had chosen somewhere along the way to keep its character rather than sand it down into something more modern and more forgettable. He met her himself in the foyer, a man in his mid-60s with silver hair and brown eyes that crinkled kindly at the corners the moment he saw her. The exact kind of grandfather she had stopped allowing herself to imagine sometime around the age of 9. Miss Rutledge, thank you for coming all this way. He led her into his office and settled her into a worn leather chair that had clearly held a great many difficult conversations before hers. He pulled out a folder, the deed, the bank records, an iron ring of keys gone dark with age, and set them carefully on the desk between them. The account balance read $12,347.16. Then his expression shifted, the professional warmth giving way to something more careful, more deliberate. There's one more matter your grandmother was very specific about. He folded his hands together. She wanted you to trust a man named Hollis Abernathy completely. He's been looking after the property since her passing. He hesitated, choosing his next words the way you choose your footing on ice. She also said that not everyone who comes to you will have good intentions. She seemed genuinely concerned about protecting you from something, though she never told me the particulars. A small cold current moved through Juniper's chest, the kind that arrives uninvited and settles in without asking permission. What had her grandmother been so afraid of? She found a diner near the bus station afterward and ordered coffee. She had no real intention of drinking, just to have somewhere quiet to sit while she opened the letter. The booth's vinyl creaked beneath her when she slid into it. The place smelled of bacon grease and burnt coffee, and none of the locals at the counter paid the slightest attention to the girl with two duffel bags and an expression like she'd just been struck by something she couldn't yet name. The envelope was addressed in handwriting that shook with visible effort. Each letter formed slowly and deliberately, the way you write when your hand no longer wants to cooperate with what your heart still insists on saying. My dearest girl, it began. Not Juniper, not Miss Rutledge. My dearest girl, I imagine you are confused. Angry too, probably, and you have every right to those feelings. I won't insult you by asking for your forgiveness. I'm not sure I've earned it. The letter went on for pages, and with every line, the story Juniper had told herself about her own life for 14 years began to come apart at its seams quietly, the way old fabric comes apart, not all at once, but thread by thread, until you realize the whole shape of it has changed without you noticing exactly when. She and Juniper's mother had been estranged for years before the accident, the letter explained. A falling out that had festered over choices and stubbornness on both sides, though Ida took the blame for most of it. Pride, she called it, the particular kind of pride that masquerades as principle right up until it's far too late to tell the difference between them. When social services had called about taking Juniper in, Ida had wanted desperately to say yes. But she had been 65 years old by then, living alone on a remote farm with no one nearby to call if something went wrong. Her own health already beginning to fail in ways she hadn't told a single soul about. She had convinced herself in the exact moment it mattered most that a grieving 7-year-old deserved a young family and a real chance at something better than an aging woman in the middle of nowhere. I told myself the system would find you a good family, the letter read. I was wrong. I was a coward, and I have spent every single day since regretting the choice I made. She hadn't been able to take Juniper in, but she had never, not for a single day afterwards, stopped thinking about her. The farm is your inheritance, the letter continued. It has been in this family for 5 generations, and I want you to have it. Do with it whatever you wish. But if you choose to stay, everything you need to begin is already waiting for you. And then near the end, the warning that made the hair rise slowly along Juniper's arms. There is something waiting for you in the barn in the back room behind the workbench. It will explain what you need to know. But please, my darling girl, be careful. There are people who may try to take what is yours. Not everyone can be trusted. But Hollis Abernathy has been my friend for 30 years. Trust him. Juniper sat in that booth for a long time, the letter trembling faintly in her hands, the coffee gone entirely cold in front of her. All those years believing herself simply unwanted. All those nights wondering what exactly was so fundamentally wrong with her that even her own blood had turned away. And the entire time, a woman 2 states away had been carrying that guilt like a stone lodged permanently in her chest, planning year after patient year for the exact day her granddaughter would finally be old enough to come and claim what had been waiting for her all along. It didn't erase the loneliness. 14 years doesn't dissolve in a single afternoon, no matter what the letter said or how carefully it said it. But something shifted quietly inside her all the same, the way a key turns in a lock you hadn't even known existed until the moment it finally gave way. She called the number for Hollis Abernathy from the same payphone the next morning. A gruff voice answered on the second ring, and when she gave her name, there was a long pause on the other end before he spoke again, his tone softer now, unguarded in a way she hadn't expected from a stranger's voice. Been wondering when I'd hear from you. A pause, a clearing of the throat. Your grandmother talked about you all the time, you know, especially toward the end. They arranged for him to drive out and collect her the following morning. Juniper spent that night in the cheapest motel she could find, lying awake and staring at a ceiling, stained faintly brown in one corner, replaying every line of her grandmother's letter until the words had worn themselves nearly smooth, the way river stones wear smooth from nothing more than time and repetition. Something waiting in the barn. People who might try to take what belongs to you. Trust Hollis. Hollis Abernathy arrived at exactly 8 the next morning, driving a mud-spattered pickup that looked like it had survived 30 Vermont winters purely out of stubbornness and fully intended to survive 30 more the same way. He was tall, somewhere in his late 50s, with a weathered face that spoke of decades spent outdoors and eyes that crinkled at the corners the moment he saw her waiting on the motel steps. He shook her hand like he meant it firm, unhurried, the handshake of a man who had never once in his life offered one out of politeness alone. "You favor her," he said. "Your grandmother." Same gray eyes. She had heard that before about her mother. Hearing it now about a grandmother she barely remembered felt different somehow, like a thread quietly reconnecting itself to something she had spent years trying not to miss. They drove out of Burlington and into the countryside, the roads narrowing steadily, the houses growing farther and farther apart, stone walls running alongside the fields like something that had grown up out of the earth rather than been built upon it by human hands. The sky hung low and heavy with the promise of late winter snow, but there was a strange quiet beauty to the bareness of it all, the way you could see clear across the sleeping fields for what felt like miles. Nothing interrupting the eye except the occasional dark shape of a barn or a stand of bare trees holding their branches up like something waiting patiently for spring to remember them. "Your grandmother loved this land," Hollis said, breaking the silence somewhere past the second unmarked crossroads. "Said it was in her blood, same as breathing." "My mother left it," Juniper said. "Didn't she?" He nodded slowly, both hands steady on the wheel. "She did. Nearly broke Ida's heart in two." He glanced sideways at her. "Your mother's name was Vesta. Prettiest girl in the county according to your grandmother. Stubborn as a stone wall, too." They turned at last onto a gravel driveway marked by a weathered wooden sign. The letters faded, but still legible. Rutledge Farm Established, 1889. 1889. Over 130 years of her family rooted in this single piece of land, and Juniper had not known a single day of it existed until 3 days ago. The farmhouse came into view, first classic white clapboard gone gray in places, where the paint had given up its long argument with the weather-green shutters, a wraparound porch that sagged gently on one side, like something leaning to rest after a long day. A few of the windows had been boarded against the cold. It needed work. Anyone could see that at a glance. But there was, even in its worn and weathered state, something unmistakably solid about it. Something that spoke less of neglect and more of simple endurance. "Roof's 5 years old," Hollis said, reading her expression correctly. "Furnace got replaced last winter. Foundations as solid as the day it went in." But it wasn't the farmhouse that stopped Juniper's breath entirely in her chest. Behind the house, rising up out of the hillside like something that didn't belong to this century at all, stood the barn. It was round. Not the long, low, rectangular shape she had always pictured from every photograph of every farm she'd ever seen in her life. This was a tower 3 full stories of weathered gray wood curving upward and upward into a shingled dome roof that caught the pale afternoon light like the crown of something genuinely ancient. It stood taller than the tree line rising behind it. A narrow cupola crowned its very center, a kind of lookout tower perched atop the whole structure, giving the entire building the impression of a lighthouse that had somehow wandered inland decades or centuries ago and simply settled itself among the fields to wait out the rest of time. She had never in her life seen anything remotely like it. "Round barn," Hollis said, watching her face carefully. "There's not 25 left standing whole in this whole country, and most of what's left is right here in Vermont. Your great-great-grandfather built it. Him and a crew of French-Canadian carpenters back in 1889. Man wanted something that would stand 100 years past his own life. He paused, letting that settle. Looks like he got his wish and then some. Juniper stood in the driveway with the cold biting at her cheeks and felt something she had no name for, yet not quite awe, not quite fear, something closer to recognition, the particular feeling of walking into a room and having some buried, forgotten part of you insist quietly but with total certainty that you've been here before. 60 acres, she said mostly to herself. Go on and see the inside, Hollis said. That's where the real surprise is waiting. He slid the massive doors open, and what Juniper saw inside stole whatever breath she had left after the outside of the barn had already taken so much of it. She had expected the ordinary detritus of an old farm, rusted tools moldering hay, forgotten machinery slowly returning itself to dust in the corners. What she found instead was a professional workshop arranged with an almost obsessive precision that made her think before she'd even fully processed what she was looking at of someone who had loved this work more than almost anything else in their life. Tools hung along the curved walls, each one in its own place on a pegboard worn smooth from decades of use. Long workbenches ran the perimeter of the room, following the round shape of the building itself, like something designed by nature rather than blueprint. Shelves held wood of every imaginable kind, oak, maple, cherry, black, walnut, each stack labeled in careful, deliberate handwriting. And along the far curve of the wall stood a dozen finished pieces of furniture, tables, chairs, a tall cabinet with joinery so precise it was nearly impossible to see even up close where one piece of wood ended and the next began. The finishes glowed with a depth of color that made them look less like objects and more like something quietly alive, breathing in the dim afternoon light that filtered down through the high windows. Your grandmother, Hollis said quietly, standing beside her, was one of the finest furniture makers in this whole state, self-taught. Started after your grandfather passed as a way of getting herself through it. Turned out she had a real gift for it. Juniper walked the length of the workshop in something close to a daze, running her fingers along smooth, cool wood that had clearly been shaped by hands that loved every hour of the work. Each piece held not just skill, but something closer to devotion, the kind of care that can't be faked, no matter how good the craftsman. She sold to galleries all over New England, Hollis went on. That's where the money in your account came from. Every piece she made every hour bent over that bench, it all went into an account waiting for a granddaughter she wasn't sure would ever come. Hollis led her toward a smaller room at the back of the barn, a converted tack room holding a battered wooden desk, a filing cabinet, and several boxes stacked neatly against the curved wall. Journals labeled carefully by year, business cards from galleries in Boston and Montpelier, a ledger tracking 20 years of quiet, patient sales. At the bottom of the last box, Juniper's hand closed around something smaller, a carved wooden container beautifully made her own name, etched into the lid in elegant, deliberate script. Juniper. She tried the lid. Locked. No key anywhere in sight. Beneath her name cut into the wood in smaller letters, open when you're ready. She worked on that thing for months, Hollis said. Wouldn't tell me what was inside it not once. Just said it was the most important thing she had to give you and that you'd find the key when you were meant to. That evening, Hollis brought her home for dinner. His wife, Peg, was a warm, round-faced woman who pulled Juniper into a hug the moment they met. The kind of hug you give a granddaughter home from a long trip, rather than a stranger who had arrived that same afternoon with nothing but 2 duffel bags and a photograph gone soft at the corners. She'd prepared pot roast with root vegetables and fresh bread that filled the whole kitchen with a warmth Juniper hadn't felt in 14 years, if she had ever truly felt it at all. Ida was stubborn as stone, Peg said over the meal with obvious affection warming every word, but generous down to her bones. When Hollis broke his leg 6 years back and couldn't work for 3 whole months, she hired him to consult on her furniture designs. Full wages, mind you, just to sit in her barn and give his honest opinion on wood grain. We all knew good and well she didn't need the help. She just found a way to give it without it feeling one bit like charity. Have you ever known someone whose kindness came dressed so carefully as something else that it took you years to recognize it for what it truly was? Peg talked for a long while about Ida, how she had kept a photograph of Vesta on her workbench for decades, how some part of her had never once stopped grieving after the accident took her only daughter. And after Vesta died, Peg said, her voice softening, part of Ida died right along with her that same day. Then she leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. But she never forgot about you, honey, not for one single day. She followed your life through whatever channel she could manage to find. This wasn't only about the property. She wanted to give you a foundation, a skill, a way to build something real that would actually hold. Then Peg said something that made Juniper set down her fork entirely. Ida had some kind of trouble years back. Someone trying to take advantage of her. She never told us the particulars, but I remember her being scared, really and truly scared. And your grandmother was not, as a rule, a woman who scared easy. Hollis shot his wife a look across the table, quick, almost sharp, and changed the subject smoothly, asking Juniper about her plans for the farmhouse instead. But Juniper had already caught it. The flicker of warning passed silently between husband and wife, like something they'd agreed without ever needing to say so aloud, not to speak of in front of her just yet. Hollis was keeping something back. She didn't know what. Not yet. That night in the Abernathy's guest room, sleep refused to come. No matter how exhausted Juniper's body felt after 2 days of travel and revelation. She lay still for a while, listening to the unfamiliar house settle quietly around her. And then some pull she couldn't quite name drew her out of bed and over to the window. The farm sat on a low hill about half a mile off the silhouette of the round barn, just visible against the dark tree line. Its cupola like a single black tooth against a sky gone entirely without stars. And at 2 o'clock in the morning, she saw a light moving inside it. A flashlight beam sweeping slowly back and forth through the darkness, the way someone moves when they're searching for something they're afraid to be caught looking for. Someone was inside her grandmother's workshop in the middle of the night. She stood at that window for nearly 20 minutes, her heart hammering hard enough that she could feel it in her own throat, every instinct in her body telling her to run down there and confront whoever it was. But she was alone in a place she barely knew, with no phone within reach, and absolutely no idea what she'd be walking into if she went. The light disappeared around 2:30. She did not sleep again for the rest of that night. In the morning, she asked Hollis if he'd take her by to check on the barn before breakfast. He offered without hesitation to come inside with her. Something in her told her to go alone first. The barn doors were still locked exactly as they had left them the day before. Nothing looked disturbed from the outside. But when she walked around to the side entrance, she found exactly what some quiet, wary part of her had already been expecting to find. Fresh boot prints in the mud. Large, pressed deep right up to the side door. Boot prints that had absolutely not been there the day before. Someone had come looking for something in the dead of night, and Juniper had a sick, certain feeling that she already knew, at least in general shape, if not yet in name, exactly what that something was. Have you ever stood in a place you'd finally been promised was safe and felt for the very first time that it might not be safe at all? She spent the next 2 weeks learning what it meant to be alone in a way she had never once experienced in her entire life. At St. Agnes, alone had meant lying in bed with 30 other girls breathing in the dark around her loneliness, with a full audience if such a thing could be said to exist. This was something else entirely. This was a silence so complete that she could hear the old timbers of the farmhouse settling quietly in the cold. The whisper of wind moving against glass that had watched over this same land for more than a century. The occasional distant call of an owl somewhere out past the fields. A sound she had never once heard in the flat, gray streets of the town she'd grown up in, and now strangely couldn't quite imagine living without. She began watching her grandmother's old video recordings on a laptop Hollis had lent her, dozens upon dozens of them spanning 15 years, Ida's hands growing visibly more unsteady with each passing recording, while her voice somehow only ever seemed to grow more certain of itself. I'm not entirely sure why I'm doing this, Ida said in the very earliest one, her hair more pepper than silver, her hands rock steady on an old wood chisel. Maybe because I'm getting old and I want someone to remember what I've learned. Maybe because I hope someday my granddaughter will watch these and understand who I really was underneath all of my mistakes. My granddaughter. She had been thinking of Juniper 15 years ago, back when Juniper had been a small child, lost somewhere inside a system that didn't know her name any better than Ida had been permitted to. Juniper watched video after video, taking notes in a school notebook she'd found in one of the desk drawers, absorbing not only the techniques themselves, but the quiet philosophy sitting underneath them. Her grandmother believed furniture should be built to last generations. She believed in honest materials and honest labor. She believed the things a person made with their own hands carried some small piece of their soul forward into a future they would never personally get to see. The wood will tell you what it wants to become, Ida said in one recording, her weathered fingers tracing the grain pattern of a piece of raw cherry. You just have to learn how to listen. Juniper built her first piece of furniture in the second week, a simple side table, 4 legs, and a flat top, following one of Ida's beginner tutorials, step by careful step. One leg came out slightly shorter than the others. The finish sat uneven in a few places where she'd applied too much stain, the wood darker there than it should have been. Nothing that would impress a single soul at a craft fair anywhere in the state. But she had built it with her own 2 hands, and when she set it upright on the workshop floor for the first time, something warm spread slowly through her chest. Something it took her a full minute to properly recognize. Pride. The dangerous, fragile kind that comes only from making something real with your own 2 hands out of nothing but raw wood and stubbornness, and the patient instructions of a woman she had never really known. She met Emmett Sorrell on a cold morning while she was struggling rather badly to repair a collapsed section of fence line along the front pasture. A voice called out from the direction of the road, "Need a hand with that?" She turned to find a young man walking up the driveway, tall and lean. His skin brown from years spent outdoors, dark hair falling loose across his forehead, his clothes practical and well-worn, his boots caked in the particular kind of mud that only comes from working land every single day of your life. "Emmett," he said, stopping a few feet off, an easy smile settling naturally into place. "My family's farm is about 2 miles down the road. Heard Ida's granddaughter had finally come." "Juniper," she said, shaking his offered hand. His grip was firm, calloused, entirely unhurried. "I know." His smile reached all the way up into his eyes. "Your grandmother talked about you often. She was a good woman. Helped my family out more than once when we needed it most." He told her the story as they worked the fence line together, driving posts into ground, still half frozen from the winter. 6 years back, his father had been thrown from a tractor at the very start of planting season. His knees shattered so badly the doctors weren't entirely certain he'd ever walk right again. No money left over for hired hands in fields that had no intention of planting themselves out of sympathy. "Your grandmother drove over one morning with her truck loaded down with seed," Emmett said, sinking a fence post into the ground with 3 clean practice swings. "Said she'd ordered too much for her own garden and it'd only go to waste otherwise. Then she just started planting, came back the next day, and the day after that. Brought Hollis and Peg along with her too before long." He shook his head slowly. "She never once called it help, called it being neighborly. But we'd have lost the whole season without her, and everybody in this valley knows it." Before he left that afternoon, Emmett mentioned something that tightened a knot already beginning to form low in Juniper's stomach. "Someone's been asking around about your grandmother's place," he said, his easy manner shifting all at once into something more guarded. "Down at the diner in town. Man in a nice suit. Wanted to know who inherited the Rutledge property, what condition it's in, whether anybody's living there yet." He looked at her directly, all the warmth momentarily gone from his voice. "Figured you should know." Juniper stood in the cold with the fence only half mended behind her, the round barn rising dark and silent against the gray sky at her back, and thought of her grandmother's last warning. The one she had now read so many times, the paper had gone soft along every fold. Not everyone who comes to you will have good intentions. That night, unable to sleep, she went out to the barn alone, carrying her own flashlight, this time determined finally to finish clearing out the last of the tack room, cataloging everything her grandmother had left behind before it could be taken from her. She worked her way through the last drawer of the old desk, checking each corner out of a careful habit she couldn't fully explain even to herself, when she noticed the bottom drawer sat just slightly shallower than it reasonably should have. She pulled it entirely free of its frame, running her fingers along the inside edges until she found it a small notch hidden in the back corner. She pressed it. A false bottom clicked open with a sound so soft she nearly missed it entirely. Inside was a bundle of letters tied together with a ribbon gone gray and thin with age. At least 200 of them, maybe more. Her hands were trembling before she even fully understood why. The envelope on top was addressed to her. Juniper Rutledge, care of the Ohio Department of Child Services. She opened it with fingers that no longer felt entirely steady. My dearest Juniper, it began. Today is your 8th birthday. I hope wherever you are, someone is giving you cake and making you feel special. I wish more than almost anything that I could be there. I wish I could hold you and tell you how much your grandmother loves you. The letter described the farm in springtime, apple trees blooming white and pink along the fence line, the creek running loud and cold with snowmelt in the early morning hours. It was postmarked 14 years earlier. She picked up the next one. Her 9th birthday, then her 10th. A letter for every single birthday she had spent entirely alone. A letter for every Christmas she had spent with no family at all to speak of. A letter for the first day of school, for Easter, for ordinary Tuesdays, when her grandmother had simply been thinking of her and had nowhere else in the world to put that feeling except onto a page. And every single envelope bore the same stamped words across its front over and over without exception. Return to sender. Address unknown. Or worse, return to sender. Recipient refused. 247 letters. Juniper sank slowly down onto the cold floor of the tack room, surrounded by 14 years of her grandmother's love that had never once managed to reach her, and something inside her that had been holding itself together through sheer stubborn habit finally quietly came apart at every seam. All those nights she had believed herself entirely forgotten. All those years spent absolutely certain that some flaw in her was visible to everyone in the world except herself. And the entire time a woman 2 states away had been writing to her on every birthday, every holiday, every ordinary day, the grief simply happened to surface, trying again and again, 247 separate times to reach a granddaughter the world kept insisting over and over that she couldn't have. 247 times her grandmother had tried. 247 times it had come back to her unopened, unread, unanswered. Have you ever discovered, long after it felt like it could possibly still matter, that you were loved the entire time and simply never once knew it? She read through the letters over the following days, watching the story shift and deepen with every single one she opened. In the earliest letters, Ida wrote mostly about her guilt, her fear of being too old and too frail to properly raise a grieving 7-year-old alone. But as the years passed, the tone changed, grew more determined, more quietly desperate. She had hired private investigators. She had found lawyers who had promised and ultimately failed to navigate the system on her behalf. She had once driven 6 hours simply to watch Juniper play basketball from a distance at a school event, too afraid the entire time to walk over and introduce herself. I saw you today, one letter read. You were playing in the gymnasium. You're so tall now, so beautiful. You look just like your mother did at your age. I wanted to run to you and hold you, but I was afraid. What if you didn't want to see me? What if I only caused you more pain than you already carried? And in letter after letter, buried among the birthdays, in the small, quiet confessions, the same warning kept resurfacing, worn smooth from repetition. The particular way a worry gets worn smooth when it never quite lets a person go. If anyone ever comes to you claiming I owed them money, don't believe a single word of it. I have never done business with a man like that, and I never will. Juniper set the letter down slowly, the cold of the barn floor seeping steadily up through her jeans, the round dome of the ceiling rising dark and vast above her, like the inside of some enormous shell that had somehow washed up on the wrong shore entirely 130 years too early or too late. Somewhere out there, not so very far away, a man in a nice suit was already asking careful questions in town. And somewhere in this very barn, in a locked box with her own name carved into its lid, her grandmother had left her exactly what she would need to answer him, if only Juniper could find her way in time to the key. Desmond Argyle found her 3 days later, and when he came without warning. The way weather arrives on a morning that had given no sign of it the night before. Juniper was in the barn sanding the rough edge of a second practice board when she heard tires on gravel, a sound too smooth, too careful, nothing at all like Hollis's truck or the mail carrier's rattling sedan. She set the sandpaper down and walked to the wide barn doors just as a black SUV rolled to a stop in front of the farmhouse. Gleaming and spotless, a car that had clearly never once in its life been asked to earn its keep on a Vermont dirt road. The man who stepped out of it matched the vehicle in every particular. Charcoal suit, polished shoes that had obviously never touched a field, gray hair combed carefully back from a face that might have passed in a different light for handsome, if not for the coldness sitting just behind his eyes, the kind of coldness that could smile without ever once warming anything underneath it. "You must be Juniper." He crossed the yard and extended a hand. "Desmond Argyle. I was a business associate of your grandmother's." She shook it because that was simply what you did, though her stomach had already tightened into something small and hard. "She never mentioned you," Juniper said carefully. "We had a professional relationship, not a personal one." His smile flickered, then resettled itself into place, practiced and cold. "I deal in fine furniture, high-end commissions for private collectors. Your grandmother supplied me for years." Juniper said nothing. She had learned over 14 years spent inside a system that rewarded silence far more often than it rewarded questions, that saying less usually got you further than saying anything at all. Argyle's gaze drifted past her toward the round barn rising behind the house, its strange dome-shaped crown catching the pale morning light, and something in his expression sharpened at the sight of it, quick and unmistakable, gone almost before she could be certain she'd seen it. "Beautiful property," he said. "Must be worth quite a bit these days. Can I help you with something, Mr. Argyle?" Whatever warmth had been sitting on his face dropped away all at once, the way a mask drops when the actor decides the audience no longer matters. What remained underneath was harder, sharper, entirely without pretense. "I'm afraid I have some unpleasant news to deliver." He reached into his jacket and produced a folded document, holding it out the way you'd hand someone a subpoena rather than a greeting. "Your grandmother and I had an agreement, a commission for 10 custom pieces contracted for a client in Boston. She took a $20,000 advance and never delivered the work." Juniper unfolded the paper, her heart sinking with every line she read. A formal contract dated 18 months back. At the bottom, a signature, Ida R. Rutledge, in handwriting that looked at a glance almost exactly like her grandmother's. "That debt," Argyle said, "falls to her estate, which means it falls to you. $20,000. Her grandmother had left her 12. Even if she emptied the account down to its final cent, she would still be 8,000 short of a debt she had never once heard mentioned before this exact moment. "I don't have that kind of money," she said. "I understand completely." His voice dripped with a sympathy so manufactured it was almost in its own way impressive. "But I'm prepared to offer you a solution. I have contacts in real estate who'd take a genuine interest in this property. $50,000. The land, the buildings, everything. That covers your debt to me, and you walk away with $30,000 in your pocket. $50,000 for 60 acres and a 130-year-old round barn that men slowed their trucks just to look at." Juniper might have grown up with nothing to her name, but she hadn't grown up stupid, and something in the careful way he said the number told her more than the number itself, that he was afraid of her taking too long to answer. "I need time to think it over," she said. "Of course." He handed her a business card, cream-colored, embossed, the kind of card that cost more per unit than most people spend on lunch. But my patience has limits. 60 days. After that, I pursue this through the courts. Lawyers, depositions. It gets ugly and it gets expensive, and none of that expense falls on me. He got back into the SUV and drove off down the gravel road without looking back, once leaving Juniper standing there with the forged contract trembling faintly in her hand, and the round barn rising silent and enormous behind her. 130 years of survival suddenly reduced in the space of a single Tuesday morning to a number on a piece of paper held by a man who had never once picked up a chisel in his life. Have you ever watched someone put a price on the one thing you had left and understood all at once exactly how little that number had to do with what the thing was actually worth? She found Hollis in his own workshop that evening, and by the time she'd finished telling him everything, his expression had gone dark as approaching weather rolling in off a ridge. Desmond Argyle, he said, the name coming out of him like something spat onto the floor between them. I should have known he'd show up the second Ida was gone. He set his tools down hard enough that they rattled against the bench. You know him. He tried to do business with your grandmother once years back. She threw him clean off the property. Told me she could smell a con artist from half a mile off, and that man reeked of it. He studied the contract Juniper had brought with her, holding it up close to the light. Looks like her hand. But Ida would never have done business with that man. She despised him. Then how do I prove it's fake? Sheriff Kessler, Hollis said. He's been after Argyle for years. Maybe he can finally help you where he couldn't help the others. Sheriff Roy Kessler's office sat on Main Street between the hardware store and the diner, a small brick building with a thick mustached man behind the desk, and the kind of steady, unhurried presence that made you believe at least a little that problems could still be solved by the people whose job it was to solve them. So you're Ida's granddaughter, he said before Juniper had even finished sitting down. She talked about you every time I saw her in town. Never once stopped hoping you'd come. She told him everything, the contract, the 60-day deadline, the lowball offer dressed up as generosity. As she spoke, something moved across the sheriff's face. Recognition first, then a cold, settled anger underneath it. Same trick he pulled on the Delacroix family 2 years back, he said. And the Boudins before that. He waits until someone dies, shows up with a contract claiming they owed him money, and by the time the family works out what's happening, he's already pressured them into selling. He leaned back in his chair, proving it's a matter of finding a paper trail a court will accept. Your grandmother was the most meticulous record keeper I ever knew. If proof of anything exists, it's somewhere in her files. A letter, a ledger entry, something she left on purpose. I'll find it, Juniper said, and meant it more fiercely than she expected to. That night, for the first time since arriving in Millbrook Hollow, Juniper lay awake not from grief, but from something closer to fear. The particular low kind of fear that comes from being watched by someone who has already decided quietly and without asking your permission what they intend to take from you. Around 2 in the morning, she heard it. A car engine moving slower than any car had a right to move on an empty road at that hour, passing the farmhouse, once circling back 20 minutes later, passing again. She stood at the window with her arms wrapped tight around herself, watching a pair of headlights sweep briefly across the fence line and vanish back into the dark. It happened a third time before dawn broke gray and cold over the hills. She didn't sleep again that night. In the morning, she told Emmett about it while they worked the fence together, and his jaw went tight in the exact same way it had the day he'd first mentioned Argyle's name to her. Could be him, Emmett said. Could be somebody he's paying to keep an eye on the place. Either way, you shouldn't be out here alone at night with nobody knowing where you are. Have you ever lain awake in the dark, certain that somewhere out past your own fence line, someone was studying the shape of everything you had left, deciding exactly how they meant to take it from you? The second blow arrived 4 days later, wearing a woman's face and carrying a clipboard. Her name was Faye Osgood, and she introduced herself as chairwoman of the town's Code Enforcement Board. Here she said, for a standard emergency inspection of the barn workshop required whenever a property changed hands. She had steel-colored hair pulled back tight against her skull, in a smile that showed every one of her teeth and warmed absolutely nothing behind them. She spent 2 full hours in the workshop, her pen moving across the clipboard with a focus that felt less like diligence and more like hunting for something she already knew she'd find. When she finally finished, she handed Juniper a yellow notice listing a dozen supposed violations. "I'm afraid the workshop doesn't meet current code," Osgood said. "The wiring in the back section is outdated. The fire suppression system falls well short of standard. Several pieces of equipment require certified inspection before they can legally be operated." She capped her pen with a small, decisive click. "The workshop is hereby ordered to cease all operations. You have 7 days to bring it up to code, or the building will be sealed pending full remediation. No access allowed until compliance is verified." 7 days. If the barn was sealed, Juniper would lose access to everything inside it. Every tool, every board of wood, every finished piece. And worst of all, every scrap of her grandmother's records that might one day prove Argyle's contract was exactly the forgery she already believed it to be. "This seems sudden," Juniper said, working hard to keep the panic out of her voice. "The workshop's been running for decades." Osgood's smile never wavered, not even slightly. "Regulations change, nothing personal." But it was personal. Juniper was certain of it the moment Emmett arrived that evening, his expression grimmer than she'd yet seen on him. "Faye Osgood and Desmond Argyle," he said. "My father's been saying for years they're connected. She hits property owners with code violations right when they're most vulnerable. He shows up right after with his lowball offer once they're desperate enough to consider selling." It wasn't only one man trying to take her grandmother's farm. It was a system quietly and patiently built to crush people who had no money, no connections, and no way left to fight back. People exactly like her. That night Argyle returned. He didn't bother with the suit, this time standing in her driveway in plain clothes, every last trace of pretense stripped cleanly away. "Heard about the inspection," he said. "Shame about the workshop. Those repairs will cost a fortune you don't have." "You sent her," Juniper said. He didn't bother denying it. "I'm a patient man, Juniper, but my patience has limits." He looked around at the sagging porch, the peeling paint, the darkened windows of the farmhouse behind her. "This place is falling apart. So is your little fantasy of holding on to it." He stepped closer, his voice dropping into something colder and far more intimate than anything he'd said before. "Take the money, walk away before this gets ugly." "Get off my property," she said, and her voice came out steadier than her hands felt clasped tightly behind her back. Something ugly flickered behind his eyes. 2 weeks, he said. "Not 60 days. 2 weeks. And when this goes to court, don't say I didn't give you a chance." He drove off into the dark, and Juniper stood alone in the driveway. A long while after his taillights had disappeared entirely, the round barn rising black and silent behind her, like a witness that had already survived far too many winters to be frightened by one more threat. That night she nearly gave up. She sat alone in her grandmother's kitchen, surrounded by things that still carried Ida's presence in every worn surface and faded curtain, and let herself imagine just for one unguarded moment what it might feel like to take the $30,000 and start over somewhere no one had ever heard the name Rutledge at all. Her grandmother's letter sat open on the table in front of her. She read the last paragraph again. "I hope you'll find your roots here the way I once hoped your mother would find hers." Roots. She had spent her entire life without them, moved from place to place, never once staying long enough to grow into anything real. And now that she finally had soil beneath her feet that was hers by blood and by history, both someone wanted to pull her out of the ground before she'd even had a real chance to take hold of it. She wasn't going to let that happen. The next morning, she called Hollis and told him everything Osgood, the 7-day ultimatum, the 2-week deadline Argyle had shortened out of pure spite. Hollis went quiet on the other end of the line for a long moment. "Be at your barn at 7 tomorrow morning," he said. At 7 the next morning, Juniper walked outside to find 19 people standing in her driveway. Hollis and Peg were there, Emmett and his father leaning on a cane but present all the same. his knees clearly still tender, but his back straight with the particular pride of a man determined not to be left out of paying a debt he considered long overdue. The woman who ran the hardware store, arms full of conduit and switch plates. A feed store owner named Delbert Kennard, who told her unprompted about the winter. His own barn had caught fire, and Ida Rutledge had shown up at 6 in the morning with 3 other families and a truck full of salvaged lumber, refusing to leave until his cows had somewhere dry left to stand. A school teacher named Louise who arrived carrying a casserole dish and a story about the week her husband left her, how Ida had simply sat with her for 2 hours in this very kitchen, saying almost nothing at all, just refilling the coffee and letting the silence do whatever work silence needed to do that particular week. The pastor from the small Methodist church in town, a couple from the farm 3 miles east whose names Juniper didn't yet know, but whose faces she recognized from her single trip into Millbrook Hollow. They came with toolboxes and ladders and coils of electrical wire. They came with donated fire extinguishers and a brand new circuit breaker panel still sitting unopened in its box. They came with coffee thermoses and sandwiches wrapped carefully in wax paper, prepared without a single one of them saying so aloud to stay as long as the work required. Hollis walked up to her and set a weathered hand gently on her shoulder. "Your grandmother took care of this whole community for 40 years, he said. Helped people when nobody else would lift a finger. Made furniture for the church and never once charged a dime for it. Fixed the miller's roof after the ice storm of '09. Planted the sorrel fields the whole season Emmett's father couldn't walk." He looked back at the crowd already unloading tools from truck beds, breath fogging in the cold morning air. "Now it's our turn to take care of hers." They worked 5 days straight. Electricians rewired the entire back section of the barn. Carpenters reinforced the old structural supports along the curved walls, their hammers falling into an easy, overlapping rhythm that seemed by the second day almost like music. Someone donated a commercial-grade fire suppression system that met every line item in the county's own code, delivered by a cousin who worked installation 2 towns over, and refused flatly to accept payment of any kind. In the evenings, once the tools had gone quiet, people lingered anyway, passing around Peg's coffee and telling stories about Ida that Juniper hadn't heard yet, how she'd once talked a bank manager out of foreclosing on a neighbor's farm simply by sitting in his office every morning for a week until he agreed just to make her leave. How she'd taught half the valley's children to whittle a spoon before they were old enough for school. How she'd never once in 40 years missed a single funeral in the county driving through ice storms if she had to. By the 5th day, the workshop didn't just meet the standard Faye Osgood had demanded of it. It exceeded every single measure she could possibly have thrown at it on paper or otherwise. On the 6th day, Hollis called for a different county inspector entirely and requested a formal reinspection. The workshop passed with a perfect score. The cease operations order was lifted that same afternoon. The yellow notice torn down from the barn door and burned at Peg's insistence in a small ceremonial fire behind the farmhouse that made everyone laugh harder than the moment probably deserved. Osgood's weapon had turned to nothing at all in her hands, and the whole community had shown Juniper something she had never once experienced in 21 years of moving from place to place. What it felt like when people chose to stand beside you, not because they had to, but simply because they wanted to. 3 days later, her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. She almost let it go to voicemail. Some old instinct sharpened by 14 years of learning which calls brought bad news told her to let it ring itself out. She answered anyway. Juniper. Desmond Argyle's voice again, smoother now, almost gentle, dressed in an entirely different register than the one he'd used standing in her driveway 3 nights earlier. "I've been thinking about our conversation. I may have come across a bit harder than I intended." She said nothing. Silence still worked better than anything else she owned. "I understand this is difficult. Losing your grandmother, inheriting all this at once." A pause calculated to sound exactly like sympathy. "I'm willing to be reasonable. Perhaps we start over. Perhaps there's a number that works better for both of us." "You mean a bigger number," Juniper said, "for a debt that never existed." The gentleness dropped away fast enough that she nearly heard the mask hit the floor on the other end of the line. "I'd be careful," he said, "about deciding you know more than you do." He hung up before she could answer, and Juniper stood in her grandmother's kitchen with the phone still warm against her ear, listening to the sound of hammers still faintly going somewhere out in the barn, and understood that the man hadn't called to apologize at all. He had called to see whether fear still worked on her the way it had clearly worked on other people, other winners, other farms. He had circled the exact same way for years before hers. It hadn't, not anymore. Not with 19 people willing to stand in her driveway for no reason except that her grandmother had once stood in theirs. It was Emmett who found the next thread to pull, and he found it in the end entirely by accident. He arrived at her kitchen door 3 days later carrying a folder so thick he had to steady it against his hip to keep the papers from sliding loose. His usual easy manner replaced by something sharper, more urgent. The look of a man who had spent an entire afternoon reading something he wished at least a little he hadn't found. "I want to show you something," he said, "but I need you to sit down first." He'd started. He explained simply out of unease, the kind that doesn't have a proper name yet, the kind that makes a person start pulling at loose threads before they know exactly what those threads are attached to. After the third night, the strange car had been spotted circling the property he'd driven into town and spent an entire afternoon in the basement of the county building reading through planning board minutes. Nobody but retirees and the occasionally paranoid neighbor ever bothered to request from the clerk's office. "There's a company," he said, spreading printouts carefully across the kitchen table. "Northridge Peak Development, out of Boston. They've been quietly buying up parcels around Millbrook Hollow for almost 2 years now. Small purchases, nothing big enough on its own to draw much attention. A few acres here, an easement there. A right-of-way nobody thought twice about signing away." He unfolded a hand-drawn map, county parcel numbers marked carefully in blue ink, a corridor traced in red running directly through the valley. "Look at this." Juniper stared at the red line a long moment before she trusted her own voice to work properly. "They're assembling land for a resort expansion," Emmett went on. "New lift lines, new lodges, an access road that has to run through here." His finger came down on the map on a parcel outlined in the same faded pencil as the property lines on her grandmother's original deed. "Right through your 60 acres. "So he doesn't want the furniture money," Juniper said slowly, understanding arriving in pieces the way cold water arrives through a crack you didn't know was there until it had already soaked through your sock. He never did. "Without this parcel," Emmett said, "their road doesn't work at all. 3 other landowners already turned them down. Flat old families, same as yours. Nobody willing to sell no matter what number got put in front of them. This farm is the only route left that connects their new lift base to the highway without cutting straight through wetland the state won't let them touch." "I don't think that debt is real at all," Emmett said quietly. "I think it's just a way to make you sell fast and quiet before anybody else figures out what this land is actually worth to people who aren't you." She sat with that for a long moment, the kitchen gone very still around them both. The sound of wind moving through bare branches outside the only thing left in the silence. "How do you even find something like this?" she asked finally. "My uncle works zoning enforcement 2 counties over," Emmett said. "Told me once that half of what ruins a small town never shows up in a headline first. It shows up in a filing cabinet gathering dust years before anybody thinks to go looking for it. Nobody reads the filing cabinet until it's already too late to matter. Have you ever discovered that the person fighting hardest to take something from you was never really fighting over the thing itself at all, only over what it happened to be sitting on top of?" 2 days after that conversation, a silver sedan pulled into her driveway, a vehicle she had never once seen before. A man in a quarter-zip sweater and expensive sunglasses stepped out introducing himself as Carter Ainsley, a representative, he said, of private investors with an interest in historic agricultural properties. He carried a leather folio under one arm and a practiced warmth in his voice that Juniper recognized instantly for exactly what it was, the same warmth Argyle had worn the very first time he'd stepped out of his own car in the same yard. "Miss Rutledge." He set the folio down carefully on the porch railing. I understand you may have received a previous offer from another party regarding this land. I'd like to make certain you're not undervaluing what you actually have here. $50,000, Juniper said before he could bother pretending otherwise. For a house and a barn, no acreage. 65, he said without so much as a blink, if we can move quickly. $15,000 added in the space of a single breath for a structure most banks in the county would call a liability the moment they learned the true cost of its upkeep. Juniper felt the same cold current move through her chest that she'd felt the first time Argyle had stood in this exact spot, the unmistakable feeling of standing on something whose value had already been calculated down to the last dollar by every single person who wasn't her. Why the round barn specifically? She asked, watching his face carefully. Not the land itself, just the buildings. Something shifted behind his eyes, small and quick gone, almost before she could be certain she'd truly seen it at all. Historic structures carry a certain premium in this market, he said smoothly. Preservation tax credits, media interest. A round barn this well-preserved is genuinely rare, Miss Rutledge. Rarer, I suspect, than you currently realize. It was, she understood only much later, the truest sentence he said to her that entire afternoon, and very likely the only one he hadn't fully intended to let slip. She told him she needed time. He left his card without argument, the same unhurried confidence in his step as he crossed back to his car that Argyle carried in his own. And Juniper stood alone in the driveway long after the sound of his engine had faded down the road, turning the card over once in her fingers before setting it beside Argyle's on the kitchen counter, two matched offers arriving from two entirely different directions, converging, she now understood with total clarity, on the exact same target. That night, she went back out to the barn, back to the desk in the tack room, working now with a different kind of urgency than the grief that had driven her there the very first time. She read through page after page of her grandmother's older correspondence by lamplight, searching now not for comfort in Ida's words, but for a thread, a name, a date, anything solid enough to hold up in front of a judge. Close to midnight, tucked into the corner of an old business ledger, she found a single torn scrap of paper that had clearly once been part of something larger, a name written across it in her grandmother's unmistakable hand, half a sentence trailing off where the rest of the page had been removed entirely. D. Argyle, do not. That was all. The rest was gone, torn away cleanly enough that it could only have been done on purpose by someone who had wanted the warning kept but not yet found, or perhaps by someone else entirely. Someone who had wanted it gone before Juniper ever had the chance to read it in full. Juniper sat back slowly in the old chair, the round walls of the barn curving up into darkness above her, and understood with a certainty that settled into her chest like something physical, that whatever her grandmother had written on the rest of that page was still out there somewhere, waiting, and that somebody at some point had already come looking for it before she had. The following morning, walking the fence line before the frost had fully lifted from the grass, Juniper looked up toward the road and found Desmond Argyle standing at the edge of her property again, exactly as he had the week before. He didn't come closer. He didn't say a single word. He stood at the fence line for nearly 10 long minutes, his gray coat dark against the pale field behind him, his gaze fixed on the round shape of the barn rising above the tree line, as though he were measuring it carefully and privately for something only he could see. Then he turned, got into his car, and drove away without once looking back. Juniper stood there a long while after the sound of his engine had faded into the distance, the wind moving cold across the open field, the barn standing silent and enormous behind her, the way it had stood through every winter for 130 years before this one, indifferent so far to every threat that had ever stood at its fence line and looked at it like something to be taken apart. She understood, watching him go, that whatever came next would not arrive quietly. Argyle's patience, whatever remained of it, was running out on a clock only he controlled. Somewhere behind him stood a company with far more money and far less visible cruelty, willing to let a man like him do their circling for them, while their own names stayed clean on every filing in the county building. And somewhere in the barn behind her, in a torn scrap of paper in a locked box, she still hadn't found the key for a woman who had spent 40 years protecting this valley. One neighbor at a time had left her granddaughter everything she would need to protect it too. If only Juniper could finish becoming the person Ida had always quietly and patiently believed she would grow into. She turned back toward the barn, its dark dome catching the thin morning light, and walked inside to keep working because there was nothing left to do now but exactly that. It took her 3 more days to find it, and she found it in the end at 2 in the morning when she was too tired to keep searching so hard, and her mind had finally mercifully stopped trying. She had spent those 3 days doing exactly what her grandmother's videos had told her to do, without quite realizing she was doing it. Watching the recordings over and over by lamplight, practicing the same joints and cuts Ida demonstrated, until her hands ached and sawdust coated every inch of her clothes, searching for a hint, a breadcrumb, some small, deliberate clue left behind by a woman who had never in her life done anything without a reason folded quietly underneath it. It came to her while she was sitting at the workbench, staring at the very first side table she had built during her second week on the farm, one leg slightly shorter than the others. The finish uneven in a few places where she'd used too much stain. Nothing that would impress a single soul at a craft fair anywhere in the state. But she had built it with her own hands, following her grandmother's beginner tutorial step by careful step. And something about the shape of it under the lamplight kept pulling at her attention, the way a word pulls at you when you almost remember what it means but can't yet make your mouth say it. She remembered then all at once the way memory sometimes arrives, not gradually but whole, like a door swinging open on a room you'd forgotten was even in the house. In one of the middle recordings, video number 23, Ida had built this exact table on camera, walking through every step with her usual patience. But near the very end, almost as an afterthought, she had added something that never once appeared in the written instructions. A modification, she'd called it, with a small private smile for whoever might be watching decades later in a barn she'd never see them stand inside. A secret compartment built into one of the legs invisible unless you knew exactly where to press. Every piece of furniture should have a secret, Ida had said, that mischievous warmth threading through her voice. Something only the maker knows about. It's like leaving a piece of yourself hidden inside the wood. Juniper flipped the table over and ran her fingers along the inside of each leg, feeling for the give that would mark a hollow space carved somewhere into the wood. The third leg clicked. A small panel popped open, and nestled inside it, wrapped in a scrap of worn velvet gone soft with age, sat a tiny brass key. Her hand was not entirely steady when she picked it up. Such a small thing to carry so much weight. Her grandmother had built this test knowing that only someone who had truly learned her craft would ever find what she'd hidden. And she had trusted across 14 years of silence and 247 unanswered letters that her granddaughter would eventually somehow become that person. She carried the key to the tack room and knelt in front of the locked box, her name carved across its lid in her grandmother's own unsteady, deliberate hand. The key slid into the lock as though it had been waiting there the entire time, patient, in a way only wood and metal can afford to be. She turned it, heard the soft click, lifted the lid. Inside, she found 3 things. The first was a second leather-bound journal, separate from the business ledger she'd already combed through, twice labeled in Ida's careful hand across the cover for Juniper when she is ready to know everything. Juniper opened it to a page dated 8 years back and felt the words land the moment her eyes reached them, like something physical striking her square in the chest. Desmond Argyle came to the barn today. Tried to pressure me into signing a contract for a commission I never agreed to. When I refused, he threatened to make trouble. I ordered him off my property and told him never to return. This man is a fraud and a con artist. I will never do business with him under any circumstances. Below the entry taped carefully to the page sat a second copy of the very contract format Argyle had handed her 3 weeks earlier. Unsigned, dated identical in every particular except for the name missing entirely at the bottom. And beside it in red ink, gone only slightly faded with the years, keep this as evidence. He'll try again someday. If not with me, then with whoever inherits this place after I'm gone. Her grandmother had known years in advance exactly what would come circling when she was no longer alive to stand in the driveway and order it off her land herself. The second item was a thick manila envelope holding decades of bank statements, property records, and a notarized letter from Franklin Marrow himself dated 6 months before Ida's death, certifying under his own seal that Ida Rutledge had never entered into any business arrangement whatsoever with Desmond Argyle or any of his known associates. It was the third item that undid her completely. A letter in different handwriting, younger, steadier, without the tremor age, had put into every one of her grandmother's later pages. The envelope was addressed to Ida Rutledge, sent from an address in Ohio, and the moment Juniper recognized the handwriting, her breath caught somewhere it refused for a long moment to move past. Her mother's hand. The same careful slanted script from the few birthday cards that had survived her childhood carried through every foster placement, like something closer to scripture than paper folded and refolded so many times over the years that the creases had worn nearly translucent. The letter was dated 3 days before the accident. "Dear Mom," it began, and Juniper had to set it down twice just to remember properly how to breathe. Her mother had called her Mom. Not Ida, not anything formal, not the careful distance of two women who had spent years unable to find their way back to each other. Mom. Like a daughter who had never once stopped loving her mother, whatever the years of silence between them had ultimately cost them both. "I've been trying to write this letter for months, but I could never find the right words, so I'm just going to say it. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for leaving the way I did. I'm sorry for the years of silence. I'm sorry for letting pride keep me away this long." David and I have been talking about what kind of life we want for Juniper, and I keep thinking about the farm, about Vermont, about all the things I ran away from when I was too young and too angry to understand what I was actually leaving behind. I want Juniper to know where she comes from. I want her to walk the fields the way I did as a girl, to understand that she has roots, even if I spent years pretending I didn't. Were you planning to come visit this summer? I know it's been too long, and I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, but I'm asking anyway. I want to come home, Mom. I want to bring your granddaughter to meet you. I want to start over. I love you. I've always loved you, even when I was too stubborn to say it. Your daughter, Vesta. 3 days later, she was dead. They never made it to Vermont. Juniper never got to walk those fields with her mother, never got to meet her grandmother as a child, never got to have the summer that had apparently been quietly planned all along in an Ohio kitchen a lifetime before Juniper had any way of knowing it. But she had tried. At the very end, her mother had tried to come home. Have you ever opened something you were afraid of and found, instead of the wound you expected, proof that you had been loved the entire time? Juniper sat on the cold floor of the tack room for a long while, holding her mother's letter, letting herself grieve properly for what felt like the first time in 14 years. Not the abstract grief of a child who has learned to stop asking questions, but the specific, particular grief of a woman who finally understood exactly what had been lost and exactly how close it had come 3 short days to not being lost at all. But mixed in with that grief was something else, something fierce and bright and entirely unbreakable. They had loved her, both of them in their own imperfect human ways, across a silence neither of them had chosen, and neither of them had been given time enough to close. They had left her everything they had to give, and it had simply taken 14 years, a bus ticket, and a barn full of secrets for her to finally understand the shape of it. She wasn't going to let Desmond Argyle take that away from her. Not now, not ever. The next morning, she called Sheriff Kessler and told him everything she'd found. He drove out within the hour, his cruiser kicking up a thin trail of dust along the gravel, and Juniper spread the evidence across the workbench in the round barn. The ledger entry, the unsigned contract from 8 years back, the notarized letter from Franklin Marrow, and the signature comparison she'd made herself the night before, holding her grandmother's genuine signature from her final recorded video up beside the forged one on Argyle's contract. "There's a mark," Juniper said, pointing to a small, nearly invisible line beneath the letter E in every one of her grandmother's real signatures. She mentioned it in her last video. Said she started doing it after my grandfather died so nobody could ever forge her name and get away with it. She set the two signatures side by side under the workshop's overhead light. His doesn't have it. Not anywhere. Sheriff Kessler studied both signatures a long moment, his expression sharpening the way it had the very first day she'd mentioned the ledger entry to him. This is it, he said finally. The journal proves she knew exactly who he was years before he ever came near you. The unsigned contract shows the pattern he uses on every single family. And this, he tapped the signature comparison with one blunt finger. This is the kind of detail a jury remembers long after they've forgotten everything else in the case. He looked up at her. I've been building a file against this man for 5 years, Juniper. The Delacroix family's agreed to testify if it ever goes that far. So has the Boudin family. With what you've found, I believe we finally have enough to move on him. What do I need to do? Sit tight, he said. I'll be back in 3 days with an answer one way or the other. In the meantime, don't go anywhere alone after dark, and don't tell anybody outside this room what you found last night. If he gets even a whisper that we've got the journal, he'll have a lawyer of his own dressed up and ready before I can get a warrant signed. Those 3 days were the longest of Juniper's life. She spent the mornings in the barn working on a new project, not because she needed to finish it, but because she needed somewhere to put her hands while her mind raced through everything that could still go wrong. She spent the afternoons walking the fence line alone, counting the fence posts the way you count sheep when sleep won't come, as though the counting itself might somehow slow the clock down. Emmett came by every single afternoon of those 3 days sometimes to help with the fence lines that never seemed to stop needing attention, sometimes just to sit with her in the quiet of the workshop, while sawdust drifted lazily through the cold light spilling in from the open doors. They didn't need to talk much during those visits. There was a strange comfort simply in knowing she wasn't sitting through this alone. On the first evening, he found her sitting on an overturned crate just inside the barn doors, her mother's letter still folded in her coat pocket, and he didn't ask what was wrong. He simply sat down on the crate beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and waited. I keep thinking, Juniper said finally, about what happens if it doesn't work. If a jury looks at all of it and decides a signature mark isn't enough, if he walks out of that courtroom and comes right back here with a bigger lawyer and a longer deadline, then you'll still have the letters, Emmett said. You'll still have the barn. You'll still have people in this valley who'll show up at 7 in the morning a second time if it ever comes to that. He turned to look at her. I don't think it comes to that, though. I think Kessler's waited 5 years for a reason to finally move on this man. And I don't think he's going to let it slip through his hands now that you've handed it to him. You sound very sure. I'm sure of you, he said simply, and then as if embarrassed by how plainly that had come out, looked back down at the sawdust on the floor. That's a different thing than being sure of a courtroom. But it's the part I actually know. On the second evening, he stood beside her at the workbench while she sanded down a piece of curly maple, his shoulder close enough to hers that she could feel the warmth of him even through her jacket. Whatever happens Friday, he said, you've already won something you know. You know that, right? Do I? Your grandmother spent 40 years trying to reach you. Your mother was 3 days away from bringing you home. He looked at her steadily, the easy humor gone from his face for once replaced by something plainer and more sincere. You're here now standing exactly where they both wanted you to be. Argyle can't take that away from you, whatever a courtroom decides. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she set down the sandpaper and let herself, for the first time in 3 days, simply stand still beside him in the quiet. Listening to the wind move against the round walls of the barn, the way it had moved against them for 130 years. Patient and constant, indifferent to deadlines and contracts and every anxious hour a person could spend waiting on news. Thank you, she said eventually, for staying. Wasn't going anywhere else worth being, Emmett said, and left it at that, the way a person leaves a door standing open rather than pushing you through it. On the morning of the third day, Sheriff Kessler called with the news that the county was ready to move and that Argyle would be summoned back to the property one final time, believing because Kessler had made certain through a careful phone call placed the evening before that he believed it, that this was simply the day Juniper had finally decided to sell. She spent the hour before 10 o'clock walking through the house once slowly the way you walk through a place before it either stays yours or doesn't. She stood for a long moment in the kitchen where her grandmother had once poured coffee for a stranger's daughter grieving a marriage, and in the front room where Hollis had first told her the story of a truck loaded down with seed, and out on the porch where in 6 months' time, though, she didn't know it yet, half the valley would gather to watch her finish her first real commission. She touched the door frame on her way out the way you touch something for luck, though she wasn't sure standing there whether she believed in luck at all anymore or only in preparation, dressed up to look like it. He arrived at 10 o'clock sharp, the black SUV turning into the driveway, exactly as it had the very first time, and Juniper walked outside to meet him, on steady legs, her grandmother's letter tucked into one coat pocket and her mother's into the other, carried the way you carry armor made of nothing more than paper and ink, and love that had somehow, against every odd, managed to survive 14 years of silence. But Argyle wasn't the only surprise waiting in that driveway. Beside the sheriff's cruiser, already parked and idling at the end of the road, stood a woman Juniper had never seen before. Thin mid-30s, standing with her arms crossed tight against her own chest, as though she were holding herself together by force of will alone. Sheriff Kessler introduced her quietly as Marilyn Dietz, one of two witnesses Argyle had lined up over the past weeks prepared to testify, if this ever reached a courtroom, that she had personally watched Ida Rutledge sign the contract in question with her own hand. "She came to me yesterday afternoon," Kessler said low enough that only Juniper could hear him over the wind. "Wanted to talk before anything went further than it already had. Said she'd been losing sleep over it for weeks." Argyle stepped out of the SUV and froze at the sight of the sheriff's cruiser, his expression cycling fast through confusion then anger, then for just a flickering moment, something that looked uncomfortably close to fear. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice carrying across the yard sharper than Juniper had heard it in any of their previous encounters. Juniper walked toward him holding the folder her grandmother had prepared in one careful form or another for exactly this morning, though neither of them could have known it at the time. "This is your contract," she said, holding up the forged document so the wind caught its edges. "And this is my grandmother's real signature." She held up the printed still from Ida's final recording. "See the mark under the E. She put that on every document she signed for the last 40 years, so nobody could ever forge her name and get away with it. Yours doesn't have it." "That proves nothing," Argyle said, though something in his voice had already begun faintly to slip. "Handwriting varies from day to day. Everyone knows that." "Maybe," Juniper said, "but this doesn't." She held up the journal open to the marked page. "My grandmother wrote about you 8 years ago, documented the exact day you came here, and tried to con her into signing this same contract. She kept the unsigned copy, and she wrote in her own hand that you were a fraud and that she would never do business with you." She let that settle a moment in the cold morning air. "She knew you'd try again. She prepared for it. She left me everything I needed to stop you." Argyle's eyes flicked toward Marilyn, and whatever he saw in her face made something in his own posture falter just slightly, the first genuine crack Juniper had seen in him since the day he'd first stepped out of that same car. "Marilyn," he said, his voice suddenly softer, almost pleading, "you don't have to do this. We had an arrangement." "I know what we had," Marilyn said, her voice thin but steadier now than it had been a moment before, as though saying it out loud were somehow easier than she'd expected. "He paid me $400, she went on, turning to face Juniper and Sheriff Kessler both. "Told me I'd only ever have to say I saw it happen. Said it wasn't really lying since the debt was real either way, or close enough to real that it didn't matter." Her arms tightened further around herself, as though the cold had finally caught up with her all at once. "I owed him money too. From a piece of land he took off my aunt 3 years back, the same way he's trying to take this one. I didn't have a choice that felt like a choice at the time, but I've got a choice now, and I'm making it." Argyle's face had gone the color of old ash. "You're under arrest," Sheriff Kessler said, stepping forward, at last his hand resting on the cuffs at his belt with the calm, unhurried authority of a man who had waited 5 long years for exactly this moment. Fraud, forgery, attempted theft by deception. He glanced toward Marilyn, his voice gentling slightly. "We'll talk about your part in this separately, Miss Dietz. Given what you've just told us unprompted, I expect the county's going to look at you a good deal more kindly than they're about to look at him." As the deputies moved in to cuff him, Sheriff Kessler added almost as an afterthought, "The way you'd mentioned something small while your mind was already occupied with larger matters." "He's already told us about the surveillance, by the way," Kessler said, glancing at Juniper. "Paid a man to drive past the property at night, get a good look at the place before he made his first offer. Didn't think that one through quite as carefully as the rest of it." So that was the car in the dark. 3 passes at 2 in the morning, headlights sweeping the fence line. Nothing more sinister in the end than a small, ordinary cruelty, finally given a name and a face. Argyle turned on Juniper with something close to pure hatred, his composure finally entirely gone. "This isn't over," he spat as the deputies pulled his arms behind his back. "You got lucky, that's all this ever was. Luck." Juniper thought, standing there in the cold morning air, with the round barn rising silent behind her, of everything she had survived to reach this exact moment. 14 years in a system that could never quite bring itself to see her. The bone-deep certainty carried for most of her life that she was simply unwanted, unworthy of the effort it took to be properly loved. 247 letters that had tried over and over to prove otherwise, and failed every single time, until finally on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon 3 weeks ago, they hadn't. "It wasn't luck," she said quietly, and she meant every single word of it. "My grandmother spent 40 years making sure I'd be ready for this. My mother wanted me here 3 days before she died. You're the one who never belonged." They put him in the back of the cruiser, and Sheriff Kessler came to stand beside her as it pulled slowly away down the gravel road. Gravel crunching under the tires the same way it had the very first morning Hollis had driven her out to see this place for the first time. "He's going away for a long time," Kessler said. "We've got enough now for multiple counts of fraud. The Delacroix and Boudin families have already agreed to come forward with what he did to them once word gets around that this one finally stuck. I'll be opening a formal inquiry into Faye Osgood's role in all of it as well. County records show a pattern of suspicious violations tied to every single family he's targeted over the years, going back further than any of us realize." He put his hat back on. "You did something a lot of people twice your age couldn't have managed, Juniper. Your grandmother would be proud of that, whatever else she'd have to say to you." Juniper stood in the driveway long after the dust had settled back onto the road and let out a breath she felt somewhere underneath everything she had been holding for most of her adult life. The farm was safe. The legacy her grandmother had spent decades quietly protecting was safe. She looked out at the fields her great-great-grandfather had cleared with his own 2 hands more than a century ago, at the round barn rising behind her with its improbable, impossible dome, catching the pale morning light, and understood finally and completely why none of the 5 generations before her had ever wanted to leave this place, whatever it had ultimately cost each of them to stay. 6 months later, she finished her first commissioned piece of furniture, not the small practice table that had once held the key to everything, but something far more ambitious. A dining table in black walnut, built from one of her grandmother's most advanced designs, studied for weeks before she trusted her own hands enough to attempt it. It took nearly 2 months of steady, careful work, with more than a few evenings, when she was certain she had ruined the whole thing beyond any hope of saving. But she finished it, and it was beautiful, the grain running clean and dark down its full length, and the entire time she had been aware in some quiet corner of herself that she was trying to build something worthy of her grandmother's name. Half the town came to see it the night she finished. Hollis and Peg arrived early with a bottle of something Peg insisted was only for special occasions, and Peg made a point of hugging Juniper twice, once at the door, and once again halfway through dinner for no reason she bothered to explain. Emmett and his father came together, the older man walking now with only the faintest hitch in his step, leaning on his cane more out of habit than necessity, and he shook Juniper's hand with both of his own before he sat down, holding on a moment longer than a handshake strictly required. Sheriff Kessler arrived in his good clothes, looking almost unrecognizable without his uniform, and spent a solid 10 minutes examining the joinery on the table's legs before anyone managed to get him to sit down and eat. Your grandmother would have made you redo this corner twice, he told her, not unkindly, running a thumb along a seam so tight it was nearly invisible. Which means it's exactly right. Franklin Marrow drove all the way up from Burlington, especially for the occasion, insisting the whole evening that he wouldn't have missed it for anything, and brought with him as a gift a small brass plate engraved with the farm's founding year, meant to be mounted somewhere in the barn where visitors would see it. They gathered around the table for a dinner Peg had spent the entire day preparing the kitchen, filled with a noise and warmth that Juniper suspected the old walls hadn't heard in years. Somewhere between the second helping and the pie, Sheriff Kessler cleared his throat and raised his glass a little awkwardly, the way a man does when he isn't used to speeches. To Ida, he said, who I never once in 20 years of knowing her managed to win an argument against, and to her granddaughter, who I suspect is going to turn out exactly the same way. She'd be so proud, Peg said, running her hand along the smooth, dark surface of the table once the laughter had settled. She always believed you'd find your way here one way or another, even when the rest of us weren't so sure. Juniper looked around at the faces that had somewhere in the last 6 months quietly become her entire world. Hollis, who had understood the land before she did and had trusted her with it anyway. Peg, who had fed her and mothered her before she'd even known she needed either. Sheriff Kessler, who had fought beside her when the fight had finally come. Franklin Marrow, who had carried her grandmother's last wishes across 2 states with more patience than his job strictly required. And Emmett, sitting close beside her with his sleeve brushing hers, who had become somewhere in the space of a single spring so much more than just a helpful neighbor with a good eye for county records. A year ago, she had been completely alone, utterly convinced she would never belong anywhere in this world. Now, sitting at a table she had built with her own 2 hands, surrounded by people who had chosen her without being asked twice, she had more than she had ever once dared to imagine. That same autumn, not long after the table was finished, a caseworker from the county called Juniper about a 16-year-old girl named Bertie LaChance, recently placed in emergency foster care after her 3rd home in barely 2 years. A girl who had, according to the thin file the caseworker read from over the phone, shown a real and unexpected interest in working with her hands and nowhere yet to put that interest to any use. She's not an easy placement. The caseworker admitted, the same careful, practiced tone Juniper remembered from 100 conversations, just like it conducted about her instead of with her. She's been through a lot, doesn't trust easy, and I understand if that's more than you're looking to take on. I understand not trusting easy, Juniper said. Send her out. I'd like to meet her. I'd bet. Bertie arrived at the farm 3 weeks later with 1 duffel bag and an expression Juniper recognized instantly because she had worn that exact same expression herself not so very long ago, sitting on the edge of a bed in a room that smelled of detergent and radiator heat. She stood in the driveway with her chin lifted and her arms crossed, the posture of someone who had learned the hard way that the safest thing to expect from any new place was disappointment, and that expecting anything less only made the disappointment hurt worse when it inevitably arrived. "This the part where you show me the rules?" Bertie asked before Juniper had even finished walking over to greet her. "There's one rule," Juniper said. "You don't have to want to be here. But if you decide you do, there's a workbench in that barn with your name on it whenever you're ready for it." Bertie looked at the round barn rising behind the house, its dome catching the pale afternoon light, and something in her face shifted just slightly, the careful armor cracking open by the smallest possible degree. "Never seen a barn shaped like that before," she said. "Neither had I," Juniper said. "Not until I needed to." It took Bertie the better part of a month before she picked up a single tool, and Juniper never once pushed her toward it, letting the girl simply exist in the house, in the fields, in the quiet of the barn, until existing there stopped feeling to her like something that could be taken away without warning. When Bertie finally did pick up a chisel on a gray afternoon in late October, she held it the exact same way Juniper remembered holding her own first tool, carefully, distrustfully, as though the wood itself might turn on her the way so much else already had. "It won't bite you," Juniper told her, sitting down on the stool beside her. I promise you that much. Have you ever watched someone else stand exactly where you once stood and understood all at once precisely what it meant to finally be the one holding out a hand instead of waiting for one? That winter, sorting through the last of her grandmother's papers on a slow, snow-quiet afternoon, Juniper found a small photograph tucked inside a folded newspaper gone brittle and yellow with age. It showed a woman in her 30s kneeling beside a small girl in front of the round barn, both of them squinting slightly against bright summer light, an old truck parked in the background, whose shape placed the photograph, as best Juniper could tell, sometime in the early 1980s. On the back in her grandmother's familiar careful hand, someone had written a single line, Vesta 4 years old, the summer she still loved this place. Juniper sat with that photograph a long while, the wood stove ticking softly in the corner of the kitchen, snow beginning to gather quietly against the window panes outside. It didn't change anything that had already happened. It didn't undo a single year of the silence or bring back a single one of the birthdays spent apart. But it settled something in her all the same. The quiet, certain feeling of a story finally closing its full circle decades after anyone still living had thought to expect it might. Her mother had stood right here in this exact spot. Once upon a summer, Juniper would never get to ask her about a small girl who hadn't yet learned to run from this place. Held steady by her own mother's hands, the two of them squinting together into a sun that had long since set on all of it. And now, so many years later, Juniper knelt in roughly that same patch of ground, most mornings herself, coffee in hand, watching the light change slowly across the same fields, understanding in a way words had never quite managed to explain to her exactly what her mother had been trying to come home to 3 days before she never got the chance. That's the thing about land. It does not stop belonging to a family simply because the deeds happen to pass through other hands for a while. The soil remembers the boots that first broke it open. The wind still carries the names once called across these fields, long after the voices themselves have gone quiet, folded back into the same ground that first taught them how to speak. This round barn had stood on its hillside for 137 years, waiting without ever once knowing her name for a 21-year-old girl with two duffel bags and $41 to her name to finally walk through its doors and understand exactly what she was looking at. Juniper Rutledge had arrived in Vermont with nothing but a photograph gone soft at the corners and a letter she had almost been too afraid to open. She stayed in the end with 137 years of family standing quietly behind her, a craft in her hands that would carry her the rest of her life, in a barn full of people who had chosen freely and without ever once being asked twice to stand beside her. It had been without any question at all the best inheritance she had ever received. Not the land, not the money, not even the barn itself, remarkable as it was, but the simple, unshakable proof that she had been loved all along by people she had once believed had never wanted her at all. And sometimes in the end, that is the only inheritance that ever truly matters.